Hey everybody, and welcome back to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields. Today we are on our final episode of our Pints and Process series, Packaging Your Beer. So we went through all of the different steps in the Pints and Process series, from selecting your ingredients, your water, mash, boil, fermentation, etc. If you haven't seen them, go check them out. I'm going to put that link in the video description below. After you get done watching this one, you can go check the rest of those videos out. It's going to go through each one of the processes a little bit more in depth than we would in a typical brew day video. So with this process, we're going to be talking about packaging your beer. Are you still bottling? Are you kegging? That process is going to look a little bit different depending on which type of packaging that you're using. So with that, hit that subscribe button. We're going to go through that process after this. All right, so let's talk first about bottling your beer. So if you're first getting started bottling your beer, you would typically use bottles, right? These little guys. So how many do you need? So a typical person would probably buy 2 cases of these and you'd be pretty close. But for a 5-gallon batch, it's usually a little bit more than 48 bottles. So make sure that you're gonna have at least, I would say 55 to 60 bottles. These are 12-ounce bottles on hand, or at least that equivalent, in order to have enough bottles cleaned and sanitized before you start bottling your beer. That's super important because if you run out at the end, you're gonna be quickly trying to find something to put your beer in, or you're gonna have to dump it out, in which case you just wasted some beer that you took, several weeks to make. And so make sure that you have 55 to 60 bottles of these things. 3 cases ought to do it, only because you're gonna get rid of some of these bottles. You're gonna forget them at a friend's house sometimes. You might accidentally have somebody throw one away or recycle it, or you're gonna enter them into a beer competition or something else, in which case they're going to not return these bottles back to you. So getting 3 cases right off the bat, you can spare a few of them along the way. So first and foremost, cleaning and sanitizing. This is going to be the same whether you're kegging or bottling. You're going to want to make sure your keg or your bottles are clean and then sanitized afterwards, including the caps that you're going to use for these. If you're still bottling, you're going to be using most likely a bottling bucket or bottling right from your secondary fermenter or primary fermenter, depending on what you're using. But most people get started using a bottling bucket, and it has a spigot usually on the side for bottling. And that that allows you to essentially hook up a hose and a pencil filler. Okay, so you would put this into the spigot of the bottling bucket, and then you would attach your pencil filler. And then as you open the spigot, you'd push your pencil filler down. It's got a little spring at the bottom here, and it allows you to fill your bottles all the way up to the neck. And so I have a video on how to do this. It goes a little bit more in depth, but essentially you're gonna wanna push this down. It lets the air out. Gravity will do the work pushing this in the bottle. And then once the beer gets all the way up to the neck, the very, very tip of this, then you go ahead and you lift up, which stops the beer because the pencil filler has a spring in it, and you pull it out. When you pull it out, it's actually gonna drop the volume of your beer down a little bit. And that is on purpose, because it's gonna give you a little bit of head space for it to carbonate. You don't wanna fill them all the way up to the top, and you don't wanna be too far down, because then you're gonna have too much head space and you'll have off carbonation. So how do you carbonate in a bottle? Well, as part of that bottling bucket process, you're gonna be using corn sugar. And so there's an amount that you would use of corn sugar that you put in about a cup of water. You bring that to a boil or cool it off. You pour it in your bucket, and then you rack your beer on top of it. And when you rack your beer, siphon on top of it, it mixes that corn sugar up. And there's a little bit of residual yeast that's left in your beer that's gonna help essentially ferment that sugar and carbonize it. So as you're fermenting in your fermenter, you'll notice your airlock moving. It's essentially the same thing. It's making CO2. Well, this is going to be enough just to get you to pressurize your beer to the right amount. So that corn sugar is super important. Alternatively, you can use something like these carbonation drops. Okay, these are 1 drop per 12-ounce bottle. I don't typically use these unless I absolutely have to. They do give a little bit different flavor than your corn sugar will if you're just using that. These I use in a pinch in case I have a little bit left over in a carboy that I'm transferring to a keg, and I get it all the way up, half an inch or so underneath my my CO2 port and I say, hey man, I still got a little bit left, I might take like a growler and I'll put a couple of those drops in there and I'll close it shut so I'm not wasting any beer. And so that way I don't have to mess with any corn sugar. So on a pinch, you can do a couple of bottles just like that. You could put those little drops in there. So then you would go through and you would fill all of your bottles up and then you'd use a capper to cap them off. Again, making sure that all of your equipment is sanitized, including your hoses, your pencil filler, caps, and bottles, right? And the process is very similar if you're kegging, except for you're only really filling one vessel, which is your keg. Some people like to go ahead and purge their keg of oxygen before they fill it up, which I would suggest doing. It's easy, especially with the keg. It's harder to do when you're doing all of the bottles. You can do it, not really necessary. I would just really, because you're using the pencil filler, you're not really splashing that beer around a lot. And so I would just go ahead and not purge any of the oxygen out of the bottles. But if you want to, absolutely go ahead and do that. For a keg though, you can opt to grab your keg, and then with your outline for your CO2, I would go ahead and just hook that up to a regular connection that you would have in your refrigerator or kegerator, and then let that CO2 kind of purge the oxygen out of the top. That at least allows you to get the CO2 at the bottom. When you're racking at the bottom of it, even if it splashes around a little bit, it's mixing with CO2 and not the air. So I do that most of the time when I keg. So as long as you're not splashing around a lot, you really don't have to worry about oxidation too much, but it doesn't hurt to do it. It's very quick, especially with a keg. And so with that, if you can go straight from a bottling bucket or your fermenter if you're going right into a keg. Since you don't need to mix that corn sugar in advance, you're going to be hooking it up to gas, and therefore it's going to carbonate in the keg itself. So you don't have to worry about the corn sugar step. So essentially you're going to take your secondary fermenter, you're going to hook it up, and you're probably going to use an auto siphon and your hose here, and you're going to give it a couple pumps, use the little clamp. I stick it about halfway down inside of my fermenter first. That's gonna make sure that it doesn't get any trube and stuff that's floating around the bottom. You don't wanna mix that up real good. Once it gets started, then I slowly slide this thing down into the beer and then let it fill up the rest of the way. And so in a keg, you don't really want to overfill it, but it can hold more than 5 gallons, a little bit more. Most kegs are about 5.5 gallons, and I fit about a 5 1/4 or so before it gets about an inch or so below the dip tube for the gas line. So the gas line dip tube is very short. The beer serving line goes all the way down to the bottom, right? So you know which one that is. The gas line, when you look inside of it, you'll be able to see the port sticking down just below that. So you want to make sure your beer is about an inch below that little gas line input, and that way your beer's not just sitting there bubbling inside of there. It may be okay without that, but you need that little head space in order to get the pressure correct and that it carbonates correct. So I've never overfilled it to where it's covering that dip tube. I've always left about an inch underneath there. And so as you fill that thing up, you're gonna then put your cap back on after it's done. You're going to then purge your keg full of oxygen altogether. So you're gonna wanna go inside of your fridge, you're gonna wanna hook up your gas to the top of your keg and the gas line, and then there's going to be a little release valve on the top here, and you're going to want to pull this a couple of times and let the air out of it and the CO2 continue to run. So pull that hatch, let the CO2 out, or let the air out, let it fill up again, purge it again, and you'll probably do that about 5 or 6 times. And every single one of these release valves are a little different. Some of mine go really fast, and some of them trickle out really slow. So it depends on each individual keg how much air is really coming out of there. So some you may only need to do 2 or 3 times, others you'll want to do 5 or 6 times. But just kind of give it a couple of pulls, and then I come back about a half an hour later and I give it a couple more pulls, because anything that's really settled out or come up from the beer then will be at the top, and you can purge that last little bit of oxygen. And so that's really it in a nutshell. And after that, you're waiting both in your bottles for it to carbonate. So that's a conditioning period, right? And so it's got to get time for that yeast, the residual yeast in your bottles, to eat those sugars, whether it be the carbonation drops or that corn sugar that you put in there, and that's going to help carb up. That's usually going to take about 2 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit shorter, depending on the temperature of wherever you're storing your bottles. I recommend storing it in a kind of a cool, dark place. I like to keep it like underneath your stairs or something like that on your lower level, whatever that is, and out of any sunlight. So if it comes in a box, put them all back in there. That's why the color of your bottles are amber. It helps block UV light, so you really want to keep them somewhere dark, and then let that happen. Also, same thing goes with a keg. Sometimes when you keg a beer right away, even though you can carb it up really fast, if you were to put it on like say 30 or 40 pounds per square inch of pressure, you can get it carved up in 24 to 36 hours. But if you let it slowly carb up at serving pressure, it takes about a week, maybe a day or two less, maybe 5 to 9 days, depending on your exact serving pressure. And so in this case, what I do generally is I hook it up. If I'm force carbing, I hook it up to about 30 pounds per square inch for about a day and a half, and then I take it off, I hook it up to serving pressure. If I'm just gonna let it slowly carbonate, I'll just hook it up, let it sit at serving pressure for about a week. But in either case, even though your beers may be carbonated in the bottle or maybe fully carbed up in the keg, there is a conditioning period for most beers. So the first pour or two from your draft or even out of a bottle, you may say, man, that's really not what I was going for. I thought it was going to taste a little different or didn't quite hit the mark. And some beers, depending on the style, of course, take a little longer time to condition. So, you know, I've had beers, especially when I first got started, that I tried, you know, the first couple of bottles and I was like, and they call that tasting a little green yet, right? They're a little bit early. And after a couple more weeks of being in that bottle, I kind of forgot about them, took one out of the back of the closet and I tried it. And I was like, man, that beer is delicious. And it just needed some time to really clean up those flavors. We talked a little bit about that conditioning period in the secondary fermentation video. That conditioning still takes place after you package in the keg or in the bottles. And so you can do that for a little bit longer. Also, if you're lagering, whether that is in bottles or kegs, you would need to keep that cold and lager for another maybe 4 weeks, right? So I'm going through a fermentation process for, say, an Oktoberfest in the fall. I'm gonna go ahead and do a primary fermentation, I'm gonna do a secondary fermentation, and then I'm gonna transfer it to the keg, and it's gonna lager for an additional 4 weeks. And so at a colder temperature, serving temperature usually is where I keep it inside of my kegerator here. So, you know, conditioning period after you package your beer is super important. And so give it some time. When in doubt, that's gonna help you do a couple of things. The cold temperatures are gonna crash any particles down to the bottom, and it's gonna make your beer clearer. It's gonna help mellow out any of those flavors that you have going on that might be a little early. Hazy IPAs are notorious again for being a little hoppy and bitter at the beginning, but they really mellow out and become really juicy after a couple of days of being in a keg. And so those are you know, situations where, you know, give it a little bit of time before you write off that you made a bad beer or not. So don't rush the process is basically what I'm saying. Give it a few days. If you need to come back and do some clarifying with gelatin or something like that, I have a video on how to do that. If you're entering your beer into a competition and you want it cold and you want it clean and clear looking, there's ways of doing that in the keg. If you're bottling, you need to do that gelatin process beforehand, right? And if you're cold crashing, of course you would do that beforehand. So that's really all there is to it, to bottling and kegging. It's just putting it in a vessel and giving it some time to carbonate. So with that, hit that like and subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot. I really appreciate all of you guys. And now you get to enjoy your homemade home brew. Cheers and happy home brewing.